What was the core problem that you were solving, and how did that opportunity evolve over time?
The thought in Brazil was that it was impossible to do a Mint-like or Plaid-like solution where you do bank account aggregation. So our first big decision after having raised a seed round, we're going to figure out a way to make the technology work to do the bank account aggregation. Fortunately, we were successful. So we were extremely early pioneers of what now is called open banking.
What initial results in GuiaBolso help you conclude that you have product market fit?
Our goal for the year is to get to 50,000 users. And when we launched in the App Store in 2 weeks, we had 50,000 iOS users. And by the end of the year, we had about 1 million users because we just got this massive viral growth.
What were the biggest challenges that you faced with GuiaBolso that shape your approach to entrepreneurship?
We got sued by, at the time, the biggest bank here, and they were aggressively trying to shut us down. And because we had such a clear social impact, we had millions of users who were really supporters of GuiaBolso. That created this shield around us, which allowed us to survive. And
can you share a specific example how Kamino have helped a company automate their financial operations and gain better control over their cash flows?
Genial Care, Series B health tech company, said, we're completely underwater. We're doing this all manually. They basically said, if you can get Kamino implemented and ready to go by the next accounting close, we'll do it. Otherwise, we can't because we're just underwater. We said, okay, let's do it. And something like 3 weeks, we were able to get Kamino up and running.
Welcome back to Emerging Fintech Podcast, your weekly guide to financial technology innovation in emerging markets. Today, I'm excited to welcome Benjamin Gleason, co-founder and CSO of Kamino, a financial operations platform serving over 1,500 Brazilian SMBs. But Ben's story goes way deeper than his current venture. He's a Wisconsin native who fell in love with Brazil over a decade ago and have been building businesses there ever since. Ben previously co-founded GuiaBolso, one of Brazil's first open banking pioneers, which he successfully exited to PicPay after reaching 6 million active users. Before that, he was CFO at Groupon Brazil during its explosive growth phase, giving him a front row seat to what a real product market fit looks like. Now with Kamino, Ben is tackling a different but equally important problem: helping medium-sized Brazilian companies automate their financial operations. We are talking about businesses that are still managing hundreds of payments manually, downloading bank statements, and reconciling everything by hand. Kamino provides what Ben calls the three layers: efficiency, control, and visibility, essentially becoming the financial operating system for companies generating between 1 to 50 million in revenue. In today's conversation, you will hear some pretty incredible stories, like how Ben literally bet his entire company on building technology that everybody said was impossible, and how he went from 10,000 users to 1 million in just 6 months, and why Brazil's biggest bank sued him to try to shut down his business. We also get into how Kamino helped one health tech company for going from being completely underwater with manual processes to fully automated in just 3 weeks. We dive into his contrarian take on why you can solve much bigger problems in emerging markets than in the US, his bold prediction that traditional banks will become mere utilities, and the simple philosophy that is guided his decision as a repeat entrepreneur. Easy decisions, hard life. Hard decision, easy life. Whether you're building in emerging markets, thinking about expanding to Latin America, or just curious about what it takes to pioneer an entire industry, this conversation is packed with insights that you won't want to miss. Let's jump right into it. Benjamin, welcome to the Emerging Fintech Podcast. I'm truly delighted to have you join us today. Your name first caught my attention during a conversation with Arjuna Costa, one of the partners at Flourish Ventures. While entering there, Arjuna shared that GuiaBolso, your first startup, was actually his first investment in Latin America. The stories he told about your work and vision were incredibly inspiring. So it's amazing how life brings people together. What started as a hearing about your journey has now culminated in this conversation, like a perfect full circle moment. I've been looking forward to this opportunity to dive into your insights and experiences firsthand.
Looking forward to it as well, and very cool connection. Like Flourish a lot, and Arjuna in particular.
Awesome. So you're originally from Wisconsin, but have spent much of your career in Brazil. What first brought you to Brazil, and what has kept you there building businesses for over a decade?
Yeah, I came down here for the first time when I was 20. I had studied Spanish. I was going to go study abroad in Chile, and I spent a couple months here backpacking around and really loved Brazil, loved the culture, and traveled all over the country by bus. So I got to see a lot of it. And ended up kind of, realizing that maybe Brazil was, at least at the time, it was kind of calling me stronger than Chile or some of the Spanish speaking Latin places I'd been. And so I went about learning Portuguese and then managed to get a first job that helped open the office here in Sao Paulo. So I'm kind of in my first professional capacity working in corporate finance consulting. I ended up coming down here, opening the office in Sao Paulo. And I also really liked the business culture down here. And so it was kind of, there everything clicked. And I said, okay, this is an interesting place to spend more time. Then left for a while and worked in Europe and ended up doing an MBA at Wharton, and then came down, to Brazil full time and planning to stay basically in 2007. So I've been here now almost 17 years straight away since post MBA.
You mentioned about the Brazilian culture. What parallels can you make comparing to the US culture?
Yeah, I think, in the US, oftentimes, like if you're going to try to sell a product or something, it's very much based on, the presentation and the facts and everything else. It's maybe half an hour to kind of like run through, and they're going to make a very objective decision, here as to how important it is to make, kind of a human connection and to, also know how to do the small talk, know how to, kind of create, open the channel so you can have an offline discussion if you need to, if there's, concerns that pop up. So it's a little bit more balanced in terms of, I think, kind of the facts and the objective side, as well as some of the subjective side. And as I was starting out my career, I didn't know very many people, even my clients in the consulting business, would be like, oh, you don't know anything here. Why don't I take you to the beach for the weekend so you could see something? And I was like, whoa, I don't think that would ever happen in the US. So some of that stuff was cool. And then, as my career has progressed, I think also, from an entrepreneur perspective, you can solve much bigger problems, in Brazil or in Latin emerging markets, opposed to what you might try to solve in the US these days.
And now, talking about this, deepen your personal and professional connections with the Brazilian ecosystem, and you're starting your career at McKinsey and then moved to Groupon Brazil. Can you talk more about the transition from consulting finance to a fast growing company?
Yeah, it was awesome. I mean, it was really crazy. It was shocking, the change in culture and speed and everything else. And, McKinsey is extremely analytical. It's about, building 3 scenarios and looking at all the pros and cons of everything. At the time, Groupon was the global expansion was being driven by the Somber brothers who were behind Rocket. So it was like pure execution. And so it was like, 2 completely different mindsets. And so I think it was good for me, to kind of see that other mindset and see this like very execution oriented approach, extremely intense because we were growing so quickly. So I was doing like more than investment banking hours. But it was like everyone was, so bought into this and into the growth. And it was cool to see, I think early on in my entrepreneurial kind of career, like really product market fit looks like. And when it just becomes, massively viral, and when you're just, growing and growing and growing. And, in a sense, it was about execution more than about trying to figure out how to grow, figure out a new product or figure out a new market. It was more like just how do we keep putting more fuel on the fire? So that was really cool to see. I think there are also some learnings, on the kind of the negative side, but on the positive side, that was fascinating. And it's like, how do you know if you have product market fit? You only know if you see it.
Was it difficult for you to switch from deeply analytical mindset to more like let's execute and learn as we going kind of mindset? Like, what was the key lessons that you take from scaling a tech business like Groupon in emerging market?
Yeah, I think, what was really good was just the sense of urgency. So, don't leave it for tomorrow. Send an email, like call someone, figure it out right now, get it, fixed, or get it, something new up on the air. So I think that was really important. I think on the negative side, sometimes it was like you're not creating necessarily barriers to entry. You're not thinking about, partnerships that can make a difference. You're not thinking about how is this technology going to scale for the, the next 3 years, because you're just like figuring out, how to survive day to day. And so, in GuiaBolso, I think I took like a mix of both experiences and kind of some of those learnings, because I think it was a pretty short-term mentality as well, the way that some of that stuff was being run at Groupon. So, definitely I think good. And it was, a hard adjustment in some cases, but a necessary adjustment, but also, seeing both sides of the coin, I think was valuable for me.
You mentioned GuiaBolso, your previous venture. What was the core problem that you were solving, and how did that opportunity evolve over time?
Yeah, so I think, at that time, Brazil was in the midst of a financial crisis, largely driven by a huge expansion in personal credit. And Brazil had, still has some of the highest interest rates in the entire world. And so a lot of people got access to auto loans and to other types of credit for the first time. They didn't know how to manage their finances and manage the credit, especially those high payments. The banks didn't know how to evaluate those people and underwrite them very well. And so all of a sudden you had this huge credit crunch and many, millions of people were going into default. And so it became very clear to us that there was a problem on the kind of the personal finance side of, education and financial management. And we'd seen, some of the things that were working, in the US in different ways, Mint and Credit Karma and things. And so with my co-founder, Tiago, we worked together at McKinsey. We said, okay, the problem is extremely clear. It's a, massive industry. If you look at the personal finance industry in Brazil. So if we can solve that problem, in a sense, there will be a lot of value that we'll be creating. And I think the biggest thing in terms of how that kind of evolved over time was when we started. The thought in Brazil was that it was impossible to do a Mint-like or Plaid-like solution where you do bank account aggregation and you could pull data from bank accounts and use that to power kind of a personal financial management application. And so we started out, essentially asking, our users, how much do you make? How much do you spend? How do you spend? And we found that people don't really know how to inform that. So it was kind of garbage in, garbage out for the model. So our first, I think big decision kind of, after having raised a seed round and we basically bet the whole company on, we're going to figure out a way to make the technology work to do the bank account aggregation and then have good data to actually, give good help to users in terms of managing their money. And fortunately, we were successful. So we were extremely early pioneers of what now is called, open banking or open finance. At the time, it was called like, is this legal? Should the central bank allow it? A lot of questions to be had 2014, 2015 and onward period.
Yeah, for listeners that don't familiar with Brazil in 2012, right? This is way back when the Central Bank of Brazil wasn't that proactive as it is now about legislation about open finance framework. It's actually, I think, back in that year they were just getting started, getting to talk about it, right? So actually, Ben is OG in open finance framework. Can you elaborate more about what were the biggest challenges that you faced with GuiaBolso that shape your approach to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think, one of the first things as we thought about building a team is that because, the term fintech didn't even exist when we started. So we were kind of defining the term fintech here. So there weren't people that had already worked in, really in startups as someone running growth or someone running, product or doing, UX or something like that. And so we essentially had to hire young kids who are hungry and try to teach them with what we knew. So it's hard, right? Because it takes longer to grow because you can't just plug in people that kind of know what they're doing. We had to do a lot of benchmarking and calls and, kind of leverage some of our investors like Kazakh to talk to other companies in their portfolio. So I think that was kind of the first, big challenge is, how do you find people with the right profile and then you kind of mold them into, people that can be really valuable. And one of the really cool things looking back on the GuiaBolso experience is that we had a lot of people that left GuiaBolso to found companies, specifically women. So I think I joke, I haven't looked at the numbers, but we might be the company that most had women founders coming out of it. So, I think that was a cool thing to see, but a challenge at the time because the kind of existing talent that knew how to operate a startup wasn't there. And then also there wasn't any really infrastructure. And so we, somebody like Credit Karma in the US plugs into the credit bureaus. Somebody like Mint was plugged into a Plaid and so forth. Here we didn't have kind of, the credit bureaus are not very solid in terms of the data. There's not the bank account aggregation. So we had to build everything ourselves. And so I think that was a huge challenge. It created, we created some competitive differentials, but also a lot of heavy lifting. And so kind of one of the learnings from that challenge is, if there is somebody in the market that you can partner with, or if there is an infrastructure solution, evaluate it and be really open to working, especially now, fast forward to today, there's a lot more in the market. And so, don't build it unless you have to, or unless it's strategic. I think we're really important. And as a kind of a last, challenge / learning, I think, our model was really questioned. We were, as we talked about, the central bank was not as open to this. They were more concerned about stability of the financial system at the time, as opposed to competition or innovation. We got sued by, at the time, the biggest bank here, and they were aggressively trying to close us down. So we went through a lot of challenges from kind of a regulatory, legal, or just the incumbents trying to shut us down. And because we had such a clear social impact that we were generating, we really could document that. And we did a lot of PR around that. We had millions of users who were really supporters of GuiaBolso and everything else. That kind of created this shield around us, which allowed us to kind of survive and continue on, because it was hard, to justify shutting down somebody, who was creating so much impact in a positive way. So I think that was also, a challenge, but a really good lesson on, if you can articulate and measure and really use PR to project the impact that you're creating. Oftentimes there's effects beyond just the kind of the PR value. It can also be, institutional or a growth tool as well.
Actually, Ben is very humble to say, but back in the day, GuiaBolso reached to 6 million customers that actively was using the app. So I can relate why they didn't want to shut it down, because customers actually like it, love it. And you probably were very obsessed with making this company a customer obsessed startup, right? Can you elaborate more about what initial results in GuiaBolso that you have in order to help you conclude that you have product market fit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing I learned early on was to be humble. So we'd often do like an A/B test, and I would say, of course it's A, but let's just test it. And it would often be B. So I said, okay, I can't be the one deciding. You have to test, you have to, get it out in front of users. But I think the tipping point for us as a company was we initially launched a PC version, so a computer-based version, because there still weren't really, there wasn't smartphone penetration with apps. And we were growing, kind of consistently, but from a small base, and it would take us forever to get to a significant user base. Then in the early days, we launched on the Apple App Store. Our goal for the year is to get to 50,000 users. We were at about 10,000 after like 6 months on the computer. And when we launched in the App Store, in 2 weeks, we had 50,000 iOS users. And by the end of the year, we had about 1 million users, and because we just got this massive viral growth. So it was, kind of getting the right format. It's a much better use case on an app. It's easier, to track your finances, to be on top of your money if it's right in your hand. It's easier to tell your friends about it and to show your friends. So it creates this viral loop. And also we were very early to do mobile marketing. And so it was kind of this white space still. So we were able to, really get a good arbitrage on the cost of acquisition as well. And that's kind of the point where we knew that we were just getting so much virality, and the user base was just exploding. And we were asking people at the time essentially for their banking password. So it was a huge potential point of friction, which also, as a company, we were obsessed with data security and obsessed with creating good value for the user, because they're giving us something, that's very sensitive in order for us to help them. And so we took that very seriously. But, the kind of that growth, despite the fact that to become a user, you had to give us your bank password, kind of said to us, okay, we've found something here that people really see a lot of value in.
Fast forward to 2021, when you were about to exit this company to PicPay, one of these incumbents. What led you to that decision?
Yeah, I think there were two kind of main things that we were seeing. So one was the central bank had by that time, essentially taken what we had built and created regulated open banking legislation. And so in a sense, from the connection to the bank accounts and access to the data, at some point that was going to level the playing field. So this kind of unique technology that we had created would become essentially available to everyone. And so we said, that seems like a potential threat for kind of our business model and our ability to compete. And the other thing is that there were just tons and tons of neobanks and fintechs coming into the market at the time with a lot of funding. And so the spending online on Google and Meta and everything else was just crazy. So, you see the cost of acquisition just exploding. Lifetime values in general in the industry were falling because everyone was subsidizing, trying to push their product with 5% cash back, or, paying crazy investment returns, that type of thing. So everyone was just kind of stealing each other's customers in a way between the banks. So we said, it doesn't look good from a unit economics perspective. We built this really valuable technology. We built this financial products marketplace. If we could, instead of 6 million users, plug that into, 60 million users, there'd be a lot of value created, and you'd be able to sell a lot more financial products. So in a sense, as we kind of looked at the market, we said, okay, who, already has a user base, so they don't need to go out and acquire them fresh. and who, potentially could really value, from this. And PicPay was one. They're actually not really an incumbent. I mean, they were a fintech and it was acquired by kind of a traditional financial group, but it started out as a kind of an instant payment type fintech. And they were trying to build, kind of a digital bank / wallet. So when we looked at them, we said, okay, they have tons of users that haven't necessarily found, a lot of ways to really engage them yet. And they haven't found, that many ways to monetize them yet. There's a lot of synergies with what GuiaBolso built if you combine that into, kind of their app, which is what they ended up doing. That kind of is what ultimately drove us to say, okay, it's, time to make a decision on, creating something which is going to be a good deal and have synergies, and hopefully we'll be able to perpetuate the model and, impact a lot more people than we'd be able to acquiring customers on a linear basis.
And after the paperwork was done, did you stay in the company? Did you actually got like a career break and you say like, hey, I just done a 10-year journey with GuiaBolso. I want to chill out a little bit and then figure out what is next? Because I'm really interested about what happened after an exit and then what specific insight or experience from GuiaBolso led you to start Kamino, your second venture.
Yeah, so this was like a little bit of a roller coaster. Like a bunch of things happened kind of in quick succession. So, we were talking to a few different potential buyers, and it seemed likely that I would have a lockup and need to spend a few years with the eventual, an eventual buyer. And so I kind of was expecting that to happen. And the way that the PicPay deal ended up going down, I ended up having a little bit of a choice to stay or to leave. And my co-founder was going to stay. He was committed, and he was actually on the board of open banking that the central bank created. So a very important institutional position. So for him to continue also in that position made a lot of sense. So kind of, I was almost staying out of like inertia and a sense of loyalty. And then I, started thinking, maybe it's time to move, to take a break really. So I was thinking about, potentially taking some time off, 10 years, as you said, really intense. We were very early in so many things. So I was kind of, thinking about that and starting to debate that. But in parallel, I was talking to two friends of mine about a business idea. Initially I thought that they were going to have to take and run with, and I would try to support them, as much as I could. And in a sense, when I had the decision to not stay with PicPay and to leave, they were like, so are you joining now us, or what's going to happen? And I essentially decided to almost immediately, join and co-found this new venture, Kamino, mainly for two reasons. So, one, they were really good friends of mine. I had hired both of them at Groupon. So we worked super closely. Guto was on my right hand in the finance department. I was a CFO. And so working very closely with Guto. And after I left, he became CFO of Groupon Brazil. And then Gonzalo was running the biggest sales division within Groupon. So I hired him, and actually he was moving here from Spain, didn't speak Portuguese, didn't have papers yet. And, kind of, one of these, like he landed, I interviewed him, I hired him. And then, he said, do you know of a place I can, rent a room or something? I said, oh, I have a room in my apartment. So I rented a room. And so we, kind of had this like very, from the very beginning at Groupon, and then we became friends and everything else. So, talking with those guys, I said, I don't want to kind of miss, the opportunity to work with these guys again. And then, essentially Kamino, kind of the starting point for me was I'd been CFO at Groupon. I'd been CFO, at various times in GuiaBolso, and always really suffering with the financial tools that were available and with the kind of banking and payments infrastructure that was in place here. So I was just, shocking to see how much was done manually still, how much, the systems couldn't even generate real-time data, how much when we made payments, there'd be payments that failed and you didn't find out until 2 days later, and you're trying to figure out, what happened. And it just seemed crazy to me, especially seeing what had happened, on the consumer side with Pix and everything else. And then seeing what was happening in terms of, B2B innovations in other countries. It's like someone has to fix this. It can't be, 1990s technologies that are going to still dominate in the market. And so, for me personally, was saying, how can I take all that I suffered through as CFO, all that I learned as CFO, and then also, really knowing the tech, stuff and how to build a tech business. If we can combine that, I think, we're very unique because we're, several ex-CFOs, also, serial entrepreneurs, trying to build something based on new technologies and, benchmarks that are emerging in other markets. And so that was really the opportunity. And, as just a kind of a last piece, I'm an endeavor entrepreneur. I'm a pretty active angel investor. And so I was doing a lot of mentoring for different companies, and they were coming to me saying, how do I get a bank account set up? How do I, start to run my financial operations? And I was doing like these one-on-one mentorships, and it's like, there's no way this is going to scale. I got to do this in a more scalable way. And really for me, that was kind of the starting point of why I decided to join and launch Kamino kind of almost immediately after stepping out of GuiaBolso.
Wow, such an amazing overview of how it was the Camino's founding early days. That's pretty interesting that you guys, ex group of coworkers, now I know the Camino is part of the Groupon Mafia, ex employees running a new startup. I wonder how were those initial customer conversations look like? I know that you mentioned briefly that you are Endeavor entrepreneur and you have one-on-one mentorship with these startup founders, and they all say the same thing, right? How can I set up the banking account? How can I manage my finance? So did you build the product and start piloting with these initial customers, or how was the first like early days look like?
Yeah. So when we kind of, we raised a pre-seed round right at the end of 2021. So this was still at kind of the top of, what in retrospect was essentially a startup bubble. And there were just tons of startups that were, launching and expanding like crazy because of all the funding that was in the market. And so we always had the vision that we wanted to work with kind of startups and SMBs and help, them with their financial management and to make better financial decisions, as we were already so well, integrated into the startup landscape. And because it was, a market that was growing so quickly at the end of 2021, we decided to initially focus on startups because that was like the easiest go to market. And we saw that, a lot of the startups in the beginning were having trouble, just setting up their basic kind of legal entities, getting their bank accounts, starting to kind of get this basic financial operation started. So that was kind of our initial hook. We knew that wasn't kind of the end vision, but that was a way to quickly get customers and to start testing. And so, in a sense, we launched products as it became available. So the quickest way of this kind of offshore structuring was fairly labor intensive, but not very coding intensive. So we were able to launch that fairly quickly. Then we were able to launch a corporate bank account and credit card as we worked on essentially the software for the financial management. And one of the ways we validated it was basically saying to customers, would you pay 1,000 reais a month to have automated, to automate all your finances? And they said yes. And then we had analysts on our side basically automating, so it was a way to, essentially test willingness to pay and make sure that the product, was something which made sense for the startups. And once we saw that that was indeed the case, we basically accelerated our plans to build out the software. We did actually kind of an acqui-hire of an existing back office software product to accelerate that even more. And kind of, 2023 basically is when we finally had kind of the full stack that we had been envisioning, which was, basically software to automate all of your accounts payables and accounts receivables, as well as the bank account and the credit card to actually execute your payments, and then to do all of the reconciliation of that real time, and to kind of bring the updated reporting around all of that. And then from there, we've basically been, kind of evolving on our ideal customer profile, which, shifted very much from startups to more traditional businesses, especially, with kind of the end of this, VC bonanza, as startups started struggling more. We kind of accelerated our plans to also address SMBs, and, I could talk more about that, but in a sense, we've also been evolving on, who is kind of our ideal customer profile.
Yes. So I actually, I think like when you mentioned that your initial focus was startups with these international structures, that they didn't know what legal entity was, how to start set up your banking accounts, their finance management tools. You said like, okay, this is a good starting point. However, as you mentioned, like the startup fundraising landscape was actually declining after 2022. So you decided to focus in and like to become an integrated financial software for medium-sized Brazilian companies. So can you elaborate more, like what drove this evolution in your business focus, and why medium-sized Brazilian companies were more important than startups, for example?
Yeah. So what we saw is that, I think traditional businesses are now more open to, using kind of cloud services or SaaS services. So there's a little bit of a tipping point happening. Startups were kind of always open to that, but, maybe now for the first time, or more recent in the past years for the first time, you have more businesses willing to evaluate solutions like ours as opposed to, old school softwares or on premise and that type of thing. Also, in terms of medium-sized businesses, they have hundreds or even thousands of payments a month to process, and in Brazil, that's still done in a very manual way in most cases. And so, people actually going into the bank, making payments, downloading a bank statement, manually reconciling, and so there's just a massive amount of inefficiency there, and there's more willingness to pay. Kind of the more payments that you have to do, the more you potentially have really that pain and that willingness to pay. And so we've basically evolved over time, going a little bit more up market to companies that do have, a really high volume of payments and receivables and cash flow challenges. They often have multiple entities as well. So, it might be a holding company with 3 or 4 companies below, and then each of those have all their different bank accounts and they're getting their invoices and everything else. So it's a ton of complexity for them to deal with. And putting in Kamino, you basically operate in a single system and in a single banking structure, all of your finances for that entire company. So we saw that creates even more value, more willingness to pay. And so we've kind of been steadily moving a little bit more market. And the reason that we decided not to go for enterprise is we saw that it looked like enterprise really wants like custom solutions, and they want you to kind of take what you have and then build out something specific for them. And that seemed really less scalable and almost more like a services business in some cases, as opposed to a true kind of software company with a more standardized solution. And so we've kind of, at least for now, kind of evolved towards medium-sized businesses, which in Brazil there are a lot of, and especially it's a pretty broad definition. So it's, roughly from $1 to $50 million of revenue a year. So it's a pretty big chunk of companies, and they have different characteristics within that. But they're typically the ones that can benefit from a solution like Kamino.
Yes, and also you can say that SMBs are powering the Brazilian economy, right? Like they are so important for the Brazilian economy, and they actually done a lot for the Brazilian economy. I'm very interested about what you said regarding the different features and different challenges that these medium-sized Brazilian companies have. But regarding those challenges that you're trying to solve them and you're trying to actually piloting the solution, you probably have faced also challenges to adoption, right? Even though there's some market signals that you say like, okay, medium-sized businesses are adopting more cloud solutions, there's still some pushbacks, right? What do you do to eliminate those pushbacks?
Yeah, I think if you reach someone when they've kind of already realized that they have these pains and that they need a new solution, if you can kind of find that timing, it's actually a really easy sell. It's usually very quick and it's quick to get implemented, and we can kind of get rolling from there. But it's oftentimes you won't be able to reach people right at that time, and so I think companies know that they have a lot of these challenges and inefficiencies, and they know that maybe what they're doing is not kind of ideal, but they don't know that something better exists. And so I think there's a little bit of a challenge around, just educating people that, now there is a solution like Kamino in the market. We've done a lot of work around content. And so, actually, publishing white papers and studies and articles and content, just saying, trying to help businesses to understand how they can manage their company better. And that generates inbound demand. And so then, companies say, hey, oh, wow, this is interesting. Let me find out more about this. And so we've actually gotten a lot of, I think, traction that way. And really the other thing that we have focused on a lot is basically the go-to-market motion. So we know that we have a good product. We know that it creates a lot of ROI for companies that are using us, and that we have good retention and everything else. And so it's more about how do we kind of reach these companies. And so in that sense, we basically have just started kind of going more like vertical by vertical, saying, okay, how specifically are we helping companies in this vertical? How do we get, critical mass of customers and that we can build business cases around? And so doing it kind of in a very methodical way and seeing a lot of traction within kind of the segments that we have prioritized over time.
I actually want to hear your thoughts about this regarding like Brazil's regulatory framework. If particularly in this case, from your perspective, do you believe that they create unique challenges for financial operations at mid-sized companies? Because you said like for GuiaBolso, they started level up the ground for other companies to compete. But why do you think like Brazil regulatory environment are forgetting mid-sized companies?
Yeah, I think, on the kind of the open finance side and some of the payment initiation stuff, the central bank is basically going by, the biggest chunk first and then kind of, moving along. And so they went first for the consumer side, which makes sense you have, 200 million consumers that can benefit from open finance and from Pix and everything else. So that was kind of their starting point. They're starting to move a little bit more towards like micro businesses and things now. They still really haven't reached kind of like true open banking solutions for medium-sized businesses. So that's, on the innovation side, it's going to take time, I think, to see some of that stuff arriving. But also just on kind of the requirements, tons of taxes in Brazil of all different types. This has spent, an inordinate amount of time first understanding what they owe and then actually paying. And so that's a challenge. And then also there's a lot of reconciliation requirements. So even like, $1 expense you have to reconcile, whereas in the US, usually below a certain threshold, you don't have to do this like detailed reconciliation. So it creates this big burden. Companies basically hire a lot of people. And then all of a sudden you have, in some cases, a dozen people just doing manual work to kind of, pay taxes and do reconciliations and things. So I think that creates, a big burden on companies, in which traditionally, kind of nobody's been solving. The banks are not focused on this kind of sector, also this segment of companies. They've kind of been, they're stuck. So they're big enough to have a lot of complexity, but not big enough to have, really good support from, a big ERP company or a big bank.
You guys are very vocal on LinkedIn. And actually, in a recent LinkedIn post from your company, finance was described as an essential tool for business clarity, similar to an X-ray that identifies problems and areas for improvement. And the post emphasized that generating profits is ultimately crucial for all businesses, even philanthropic ones. So based on this perspective, would you say that Kamino's primary objectives for small and medium-sized businesses in Brazil is to help them achieve greater financial clarity and improve their profitability?
Yeah. And one of the things we saw from a macro level is that 60 to 80% of new jobs and new GDP are generated by, these SMBs. And essentially it's, when they grow, that essentially they drive new growth into the economy. And so what we're saying is how can we help these businesses essentially, one, to not go bankrupt, right? Because they have lost sight of their finances, but then also to grow. And so we think about it kind of as three layers. So the first layer really around efficiency. So how do we automate a lot of things that are manual today to make them, also more effective in terms of payroll and everything else, but essentially, remove this kind of very manual layer. Through that, then you can give them tools to help them control better their spending and to control better their cash flows, and then finally, generate visibility to ultimately make better decisions and to really drive the business forward. And so that's essentially kind of this triangle that we think about on efficiency, control, and visibility. And we think that's the key for businesses to survive and to grow.
And it's fascinating how you mentioned these points that actually kind of like describe what Kamino does for the business. So can you share like a specific example and how Kamino has helped a company automate their financial operations and gain better control over their cash flows?
Yeah, and I'll bring a startup example because that's I think a lot of the audience here, and as a cool case actually, was one that I was pretty closely involved with was Genial Care. So it's I think Series B health tech, really cool company here in Brazil. And when we talked to them, they basically said, we're completely underwater. We're doing this all manually, and their biggest challenge is that they help basically kids with autism, so families and kids with autism with a combination of kind of online and offline tools. But they also have a network of care providers that they essentially work with and then reimburse. And so they had to basically make hundreds of weekly payments to these different care providers. Payment amounts were different. The providers that needed to be paid were different every week. And so they're doing all of this manually. And they basically said, if you can get Kamino implemented and ready to go by the next accounting close, we'll do it. Otherwise, we can't because we're just underwater. We don't even have like the bandwidth to look at this. And we said, okay, let's do it. And something like 3 weeks, we were able to get Kamino up and running and implemented and help them with their accounting close, and then making all of these payments, reconciling all these payments. And so it was really cool to see that in a sense that we're going to have to hire a ton of analysts and start basically attacking the problem manually, or hire Kamino and basically with a chief of staff / CFO plus one analyst be able to continue running the operation without having to increase headcount. So that was I think a really cool use case on just how fast we were able to help them, for that type of, especially, many of our customers are that type of profile where they have to make payment, B2B payments to, kind of freelancers or different kind of provider. The amounts may vary. That's really hard to deal with. It's very different than just, a payroll, which is, somewhat more consistent in terms of, just running it every month.
Yes, and this company is one of the 1,500 companies that you guys serve every single day. So I'm interested to know what patterns have you seen in how these Brazilian companies adopt this solution? Like, were you surprised in any cases that they have encountered a use case that you didn't actually visualize or know about first?
Yeah, I think one thing which is very different from the US, for example, is that ERP penetration is very low in Brazil, and so in the US, kind of almost all small companies will use like a QuickBooks. Here, they're probably using Excel and manual labor. So from a first piece, we had to figure out, okay, how do we serve companies that really don't have anything? But then as we started to go more kind of up market, we find companies that have ERPs, and then we also had to think about, okay, if they do already have an ERP, how can we be a complementary solution? On top of that, a wider solution set, and the use cases vary a little bit depending on that. It was actually, to me, kind of funny because in GuiaBolso, we built, this like personal financial management with charts and all this stuff. And we saw that the main use feature at the time was basically checking the balance of your bank accounts. That was like the first thing, it's like, how much cash do I actually have? So one thing which, I found ironic / surprising was that's also a very used feature here. So it's, essentially companies saying, okay, how much money do I actually have in my different bank accounts? So it's, although we talk about, the reporting and all this other stuff, like the financial intelligence, like there is a first, basic survival of how much cash do I have on hand right now. So I think that was interesting for us to see. And as we've gone more up market, then companies do become usually more sophisticated and they have a wider, range of use cases. But, at the very base level, it's like, just help me to understand like what's going on right now. So I think that's been something that we have focused on more. Initially we thought we might go more quickly towards like CFO type intelligence tools. And we realized like there's so much to be done, really, just more at even like the controllership level, that we focused, I think, more attention there than we had expected to on our roadmap.
And that's very interesting that you, as a second time founder, you see the parallels from your initial company like GuiaBolso that actually can apply right to Kamino. So how has your approach to team building and company culture like changed from GuiaBolso to Kamino?
Yeah, I think one thing for sure is that nowadays there are a lot more people in the market that have the previous experience that have run growth or product or UX or whatever, and so that's nice. So we've been able to, pull in also some ex-GuiaBolso people, but then also pull in people from other startups that kind of hit the ground running faster. So that's been good. I think one learning thing that we had from GuiaBolso is that it was, very much impact driven. And we talked a lot about that for many, many years, even focused on revenue. We were very much more focused on, increasing the user base and creating a lot of, good tool with retention. And then when, at a certain point, you do need to generate revenue, obviously, and ultimately, seek to get towards a break even. I think that was like a little bit of a shock when we really had to start pushing that more in GuiaBolso. So some of the people were like, wait a minute, I'm just here to, kind of create impact, and almost like it's an NGO or something, in some people's minds. And so I think, here from the very beginning, we've been very focused, one on, from a business model perspective, how do we, kind of generate revenue from the very beginning, but then also how do we bring in people that understand, this is a business, we do create this, very cool impact, and that's an important piece, but also we need to be financially sustainable, as a business. And so just kind of bring in that mindset on the one hand. And I think the other quality that we really look for is people with, a lot of grit, that we say. So, essentially resilient people that understand early stage startups. You're going to test things, they might not work. You're going to change direction and everything else. So people that are comfortable with that and can thrive in that type of environment. So I think we've made some mistakes on hiring there. And oftentimes it was maybe people that didn't have the necessary kind of grit and understanding of what an early stage startup is. So we've really, kind of corrected towards really making sure that we try to identify that characteristic of people as they're coming in, and built this, now very resilient and high performing team.
You mentioned very very closely about like how you guys were identifying these key metrics about how add value to the customer and impact to the customer. Was that your thought process while you were like focusing on these key metrics?
Yeah, for GuiaBolso, that was kind of how we thought about it, and the growth was just so fast. The user curve was increasing so quickly. It was, really unique. And so even our investors from, the US and everything else were supporting a strategy of worry so much about monetization now. Let's focus on continuing to grow. There's also kind of the defensive aspect of, if we get millions of users supporting us, it'll be harder to try to shut us down or, or create legislation against us or something. And so there was, we thought a little bit about that. And the other thing too is that we did a little bit of testing around, okay, how do we offer, products from partners into our user base? And what we saw is that the banks here really weren't ready to offer, digital, loans or credit cards or anything else. So, kind of what Credit Karma does in the US, we were light years away from here in Brazil. So it also took longer, to kind of get the bank partners really ready to originate products in a digital format and in a way that was consistent with, how we believe we should, with the types of price we should give users on our app. And so also that was, just took longer because we're such a pioneer in the market. So I think, there were a lot of learnings there. It's some, in many ways, I think we did the right thing because without that user base, we maybe would have faced even more headwinds, but also, figuring out a way to monetize the business is important, right? And so I think nowadays, kind of we're trying to find the right mix, but, when in doubt, we're trying to say, okay, let's guarantee that we have willingness to pay from the very early days. And I think that the most interesting thing for me from that is, in a sense, like if you say, oh, I would normally charge you 1,000, reais a month, but I'm not going to charge you anything. You might say, oh, this is awesome. Thank you. You guys are amazing. I love the product. If we actually charge 1,000 reais, you might say, okay, there's a bug here. I'm not happy with this. I'm not happy with that. So it forces you to actually build a much better product when you are actually charging people what the product, should be worth. And they force you then to, fix any issues that you have. And so I think the feedback loop is more realistic. And so I think our product is much more robust today, in part because we actually do, charge for the value that we think that we're creating. So I think that's been a really good dynamic to see play out.
And also, I think like it's very interesting in the landscape that you're working on. I think Brazil's macroeconomic environment has been changing and evolving from bad to good to good to bad. And once again, so it could be very volatile. So how do you navigate uncertainty around inflation, interest rates, and currency that actually is affecting your ideal customer? And how do you maintain calm while you were actually building this financial product to these customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a first level, we just expect that things are going to be volatile and that things are going to change, and that whenever something looks good, at some point it's going to look bad again. And we were kind of laughing. One of our investors from the U.S. asked us like, "Oh, interest rates in the U.S. have gone from 0 to 2%. Everyone's freaking out. Like, how do you guys look at that?" We're like, "Well, we'd love 2% interest rates." We just assume that it's going to be worse and more volatile. And so I think on a high level, you just kind of build resilience into your business, and one reason I wouldn't want to go to a pure credit business, for example, is that I think it is really hard to navigate those macroeconomic cycles, especially as an early stage credit startup. So I'm happy that we are not going down that path. I think SaaS is more robust and resilient. But for startups, what we always kind of recommend is, if in a sense you get around and you're projecting that you're going to spend that over 24 months, basically in Brazil, you should probably bring the cash down now at the interest rate that that it is right now, and not play roulette with interest rates, trying to kind of time that in the future. And so I think there are certain things you can do to kind of like lock in and say, okay, this is my plan. I know I have this much cash for my local spending needs. I'm going to build this over time. I think not worry too much about the rest of it. In a sense, when I talk to investors that are really freaked out by the currency swings, I said maybe that's not a great investor to bring into our business. Different than a Flourish or QED or others that invest in emerging markets all the time. They understand about markets will swing, but if the underlying opportunity makes sense, then you should go for it and not try to time the market. So I think there are ways you can try to also, find the right investors and the right employees and build the right type of business that in a way which, in a sense, you're not so worried about short-term swings.
So I would love to hear more about how important actually is now Kamino in this context for your customer, right? So can you elaborate more like how your customers are actually delighted that Kamino exists to navigate through these complex times?
Yeah, and I think in Brazil, because some of the interest rates are some of the highest in the world, companies are kind of so oftentimes disorganized, or just it's such a challenge to manage your cash in and your cash out, that you end up being late on payments. And when you're late on payments, you automatically usually will get like a fine plus, then the clock starts running on interest rates. And, companies are just used to kind of running. They don't even realize it. It's just a cost of doing business. They might have 5% of their turnover, which is basically just getting sucked up by fees and interest. And so you're bringing the clarity there and automating the payment, making sure it's done on, the day that the payment is actually due. That already brings, results to the business because they're not paying all these late fees. So I think that's really the first thing, given how expensive it is here to pay late, just that alone for businesses is huge because you're kind of unlocking money. The next piece is, helping them to collect better. So on, the accounts receivable, if they can do better at getting, the money from more of their customers quicker, that also helps on the cash flow perspective. And so just kind of all of these things really related essentially to cash flow management makes a huge difference. And it's hard to do, in Excel and with downloaded bank statements.
No, 100% agree with you on that statement. That I think you guys are solving the burden of financial management for these medium-sized businesses that actually are running in spreadsheets and doing manual tasks. So I'm glad that Kamino exists. Where do you see Kamino in 3 or 5 years? Like, what is your vision for this company's evolution?
Yeah, I think, we want to kind of complete this vision of not only really helping kind of the controllership and the efficiency around the cash, to also be able to provide more of kind of the CFO cockpit to help the CFO make better decisions, get access to better financial products, and really ultimately grow the business and be kind of a partner for, with the owners to drive the business forward and see the companies really prospering when they work with us. And I think, clearly some of the things around AI will be a way to unlock a lot of intelligence around the data that we're already, collecting for the businesses. And I think, ultimately what we're doing, we're very focused on Brazil. I think there's a ton to do in Brazil. There's a huge market here, but obviously in Mexico and in other markets, companies are also struggling with similar things. So on a 5-year horizon, I would expect that we'd probably be also operating in other markets, helping similar companies with similar challenges.
What type of considerations do you think you need to do first in order to drive those strategic decisions, right? Like, what do you need to unlock to actually get to this point to use AI, to enable AI in your platform?
Yeah, I think, data, first of all, is really key. So, how are you collecting the data? How are you structuring the data? How much are you able to, even if it's manually at first, generate actual insights from the data, to help your customers. So we've done, a few kind of pilots around that before, turning it all over to an AI, right? And I think, we saw the same thing with, the GuiaBolso, where we're pulling in all this bank data. The banks were like, wow, this is amazing if we could have access to that data, but it's, it's raw unstructured data. So until you turn that into, variables and categories and intelligence, you can't really leverage it for data science and nowadays AI. And so I think the first piece has been really building kind of a robust data infrastructure, making sure that we're actually, have the building blocks in place so that we can then apply where it makes sense. So I think, that's on the one hand. The other hand, just in general for all startups, but particularly fintechs, when I talk to, early stage, fintechs that are pitching me and everything else, they talk a lot about the problem and the product that they have in mind. I increasingly almost like think that's an afterthought if you haven't figured out go-to-market. And so I think the biggest thing is, can you find a go-to-market strategy that will be truly scalable with reasonable acquisition costs and build a business that really has good unit economics. And kind of until you've done that in a way which you can kind of clearly see that this will scale and that you can replicate it. I think it's probably too early to think about going to another country or going into a completely different ICP or something like that. And so, I think that's another piece where we're very focused on here is that kind of go-to-market motion. And we wouldn't want to, kind of think about going in, expanding too much before we're really confident on kind of, we got this figured out. We think it translates to, whether it's a different customer profile or it translates to a different geography, do that in a very thoughtful way.
If you were to make like one bold prediction about the future of financial management in emerging markets that most people will disagree with today, what would it be?
I think, seeing that at some point, truly the open finance and the payment initiation is going to, catch up and really, start to work, especially if the central bank keeps, with their agenda of really pushing this. In a sense, you're going to lose a lot of like the advantage of, having data like siloed customers the data will become more freely available. And then particularly, I think the friction around actually moving money. So, still nowadays, most people, until 10 years ago, they still had to go to a bank branch. Now they go to the bank app to move money. So even if I want to do something, with Kamino, I have to go into my bank account and then I move the money to Kamino and then Kamino moves it onward. I think once you can really move the money from, it doesn't matter where it's sitting, but you can move it from, let's say, Kamino to anywhere that you need to use it, even if it's sitting in Itaú or Bradesco or whatever. I think the banks will essentially, or many of the banks that don't innovate will really look like utilities. They're just going to be the pure rails. They're not going to, really have any almost customer interaction, and they'll have trouble generating fees more than just a utility on just kind of that toll of maybe a few cents around the money movement, but they won't be able to command these huge fees on just, holding a bank account or making payments and that type of thing like they do today. So I think on the one hand, banks will start to look more like utilities. And I also think traditional ERPs will really lose a lot of traction because they're just so still manual and they have trouble getting the data and they don't organize the data very well. So I think, AI will also replace a lot of those like traditional ledger systems that are so difficult to implement and to maintain.
In terms of, you were talking about particularly money movement and how these banks are going to become utilities. Do you see like any sort of technology like stable coins to be adopted internally in Brazil, in our emerging markets, so it can actually be considered like a new way to for payments for consumers and businesses?
The central bank has a pretty aggressive agenda around, the kind of digital currency, so Drex and blockchain. So they're pushing a lot of these things, and I think it will create more efficiency for sure. But I think, not necessarily from like currently from a kind of business or consumer perspective in the short term. I think what's going to have probably more impact is some of the stuff around, AI. So making, helping companies to make better decisions on where do they allocate their cash, when do they make payments, how do they make payments, on kind of the existing rails. And I think some of the banks also are starting to develop APIs and give API access to partners. And so we kind of see this, call it like API banking, where what you have around your financial data and your financial kind of intelligence, and then what you have around your payments will become a single thing. And whether it's, on the exact same platform or whether it's on, different systems connected all by APIs in a very seamless way. I think that will be where the future is going to. If the banks are developing APIs, we're working with a few of them. I think they might stay ahead of the curve, and the ones that are so closed and really trying to keep customers siloed in their ecosystem will struggle a lot more.
Due to these new developments from the Brazilian Central Bank, Brazil Fintech is a pioneer in innovation, but that the startup ecosystem has become increasingly crowded. So what do you think about differentiation for Kamino against other traditional incumbents or other fintech solutions?
Yeah, I think it goes back to kind of the distribution or go-to-market challenge. And so, I think it's going to be hard for new entrants into the market that are going to try, to essentially acquire millions of customers via Google or Meta. I think that ship has sailed, that there's so many, kind of good challengers already in the market for a lot of things. So I think, on the one hand, even the incumbents offerings in some cases have gotten a lot better because of, like a new bank coming in has forced Itaú to be better as well. So you've generally seen, I think better quality, which is good. It's a positive thing for the entire ecosystem, also for the incumbents to get better. But I think for new kind of entrants, focusing on specific verticals or focusing on specific niches, which are not well, covered today, will make a lot of sense. And whether that turns into, a sustainable business that is venture backed, going to go through the series, or maybe at some point you end up, selling to a bigger business and it's a kind of an acquisition of a specific product or a specific customer segment. I don't think that's a bad thing, and sometimes that's the right outcome. As opposed to essentially, creating a business that doesn't have unit economics that makes sense and eventually, just running out of cash. So I think people are going to need to be smarter because especially in Brazil, different than the rest of LATAM, I think Brazil actually does have, pretty strong penetration of banking products and credit card products and fintech solutions. So you can't just be the first one to create kind of a basic use case today. I think those have already been covered.
What is the best piece of advice that you have received as a repeat entrepreneur?
I think it's something like easy decisions, hard life, hard decisions, easy life. And really what that means is, everyone talks about, for example, fire fast and fire fast. Usually first time entrepreneurs don't fire fast. So they hire, but they don't fire. They take too long to make decisions or to test things. And so I think that's been one of the important things. And my co-founder was really, really good at this. He's very decisive and just kind of like, okay, if it's not the right direction, cut your losses and move on to something that might make more sense. And so, not kind of letting inertia take over or avoiding hard decisions so that you can think you're going to be better off. It's making the hard decisions and then, ultimately being way better off. So that's been a super, I think, important lesson and something that we're trying to apply consistently.
What is a commonly held belief about building in emerging markets that you strongly disagree with? Now that you have been working your entire career almost in Brazil compared to developed markets like in the US, like what is a commonly held belief about building in emerging markets that you strongly disagree with?
Yeah, I think, one is that some people think that the markets are pretty homogenous. So it's like, oh, the Latin American market. Oh, if you operate in Brazil, you should operate in Mexico because it's probably the same. Like they're massively different markets, tons of barriers to entry and different challenges to be had. So don't underestimate, how different potentially, different emerging markets can be. And then also, you have to have boots on the ground, right? So you can't launch in Brazil, from outside and think you're gonna have a country manager and somehow they're gonna, launch a product in Brazil. It's just not going to happen. So I think that the need to have teams on the ground with local knowledge, it just can't be replaced. And so I think those are two things that, especially maybe, US VCs don't fully understand unless they're active emerging markets investors.
What was a habit and a practice that has the biggest positive impact on your life as an entrepreneur?
On the one hand, just exercise, so regular exercise, and GuiaBolso is so intense, and like during fundraisings and this type of thing, often I would stop doing it because I thought I just didn't have time, and I always suffered whenever I stopped. And so especially now with Kamino, it's just like how can I create a consistent routine where I'm really making sure that I'm doing the the exercise and the physical activities that I like and that will keep me kind of grounded and energized. And the other, just as like more of a general philosophy, I try to be helpful in the market as much as possible, and people have been helpful to me. And so, I'm not a very spiritual person, but it's like kind of like ultimately karma, right? If you do things that are not, ethically correct, and if you cut corners and don't have solid values and don't help people and treat it like a zero-sum game, it comes back to bite you, I think. And so I just believe in, trying to be a resource for the market. And I don't think that we're competing with, I would say if you're competing with another fintech, you're probably both screwed because it's not a big enough market. So unless you're taking market share from incumbents, then, you're probably in the wrong market. And so as opposed to looking at everyone as a threat or a competitor, trying to help. And I think that's how, the ecosystem will continue to evolve. And that's kind of what I try to live by. And it's been super useful for me as well. Eventually things come back around. Even people I give mentorship for fundraising to help them raise money. When I came back for Kamino, I was like, wow, 2021, the landscape's totally different than what I went through. So I talked to some of the same people who helped me then to understand the 2021, seed landscape. And so I think that's really cool just to see, kind of how the cycle goes.
You have faced many market shifts in emerging markets, especially in Brazil. What advice would you give to entrepreneurs looking to build fintech solutions for emerging markets?
I think you just assume that you're going to have volatility and the market is going to shift. And so think about, how do you build really a resilient business and really solve a real problem. I think some of these things that like become fads, when there's a lot of money in the market, when the market changes, then the money flows out. You're not going to continue to get funding for those things. And so unless you're like solving a real problem in a real market, it's probably a short-lived business. And the last thing is, do something that you really care about, right? It could be a 10-year journey, so if it's something you just saw an opportunity, you kind of were like, oh, let me try this. Like you're not going to stick with it for 10 years. So find something you're passionate about.
Thank you, Ben. This has been an incredible conversation. So before we wrap up, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to share with our audience?
Well, one, kudos to you. When you reached out to me, I said, I've been enjoying the content that you're creating, and it's cool to see someone, kind of putting market maps and structure into what's happening in LATAM. So thank you for that. Good to keep up the good work there. And I guess to all the Brazilian, startups, especially Series A, B, C, or other companies that are listening, check out Kamino. We can definitely help you with your financial efficiency, and we're available. So hopefully we can continue to all support each other here.
Thank you, Ben, for joining us on Emerging Fintech. I really appreciate you taking the time.
I enjoy the conversation and look forward to more interactions in the future. Thank you.